Hashtag. He sat there, adjusting the $500 silk tie that my credit card had paid for, wearing a smile like a predator who had just cornered his prey. Julian thought I was just a naive wife, a lamb lost among legal wolves. But he forgot who I really am. I do not play to tie. I play to win. The yellow envelope in my purse is not just evidence. It is a death sentence for his fake upper-class life. My name is Layla Foxworth, and as I sat in the hushed, sterile atmosphere of the Boston family court, I felt less like a human being and more like a carcass being appraised by a butcher. At 38 years old, I had built Orionis Systems from a concept sketched on a napkin into a biotechnology empire worth billions. Yet in this room, under the flickering fluorescent lights that hummed with a headache-inducing frequency, my identity was being reduced to that of a negligent wife. The air conditioning was working too hard, blasting recycled, frigid air that smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper, chilling the skin but failing to cool the boiling tension that thickened the room. I sat with my spine pressed against the hard mahogany of the defendant's chair, my posture rigid, my expression deliberately vacant. I wore a charcoal suit, tailored to the millimeter, devoid of jewelry save for a simple watch. It was armor. Across the aisle, the man I had married 5 years ago was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Julian Thorne shifted in his seat, his shoulders hunched forward in a calculated display of defeat. He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, messing it up just enough to look distressed, a gesture I recognized instantly. He had practiced that exact move in our master bathroom mirror 3 days ago, checking his reflection to ensure it conveyed the perfect amount of heartbroken vulnerability. Presiding over this farce was Judge Harrison Vance. They called him the Iron Gavel in legal circles, a man known for his distaste for drama and his brutal adherence to the letter of the law. He sat high on the bench, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles and cynicism, peering over half-moon spectacles as he flipped through the dossier before him. The only sounds in the room were the rhythmic, staccato clacking of the court reporter's typing machine and the heavy, ominous rustling of paper as Judge Vance turned a page. Every turn sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. "Your Honor." The voice broke the silence, oily and smooth. It belonged to Marcus Blackwood, Julian's attorney. Blackwood was a man who wore suits that cost more than most cars and possessed a moral compass that pointed strictly toward his own bank account. He stood up, buttoning his jacket with a flourish. "We are here today not just to dissolve a marriage, but to rectify a gross imbalance. My client, Mr. Thorne, has spent the last 5 years living in the shadow of his wife, sacrificing his own burgeoning career as a venture capitalist to support, nurture, and strategically guide the explosion of Orionis Systems." I watched Blackwood pace the floor. He was good. I had to give him that. He painted a picture of domestic tragedy that was almost compelling. Provided you knew absolutely nothing about the truth. "We are requesting," Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to a somber register, "an equitable distribution of marital assets, specifically 50% of all liquid assets, 50% of the unvested stock options in Orionis Systems, and full title to the property on Martha's Vineyard. As compensation for the emotional distress and professional stagnation Mr. Thorne has suffered. 50%. The number hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I did not blink, though the sheer audacity of it sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. He wanted half of my blood, sweat, and tears. He wanted half of the legacy my parents had died leaving me to protect, and the Martha's Vineyard house. That was not just real estate. That was where my father had taught me to sail. That was where my mother had painted her watercolors. It was the sanctuary Julian had defiled with his presence, and now he wanted to take it from me entirely. Julian looked up at the judge, his eyes wide and glistening. "I never wanted it to come to this, Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling with a masterful fragility. "I loved Layla. I still do, but I cannot walk away with nothing after I gave her everything. I was her rock. When the board wanted to oust her in 2020, I was the one who stayed up with her until 4 in the morning, night after night, drafting the strategy that saved her position. I was the invisible director of strategy. I did not ask for a title. I did not ask for a salary. I did it for love. And in return, I was pushed aside. I stared at the side of his face. It was fascinating, in a grotesque way, to watch a human being lie so effortlessly. The incident in 2020 he was referring to, I remembered it vividly. I had indeed stayed up until 4 in the morning, fighting for my life against a hostile takeover. Julian had been in Aspen on a ski trip with his boys, and when I had called him in a panic, he had told me I was being hysterical and hung up because the reception was bad. Strategic director, I thought to myself. The only strategy Julian had ever directed was how to siphon money from our joint account without triggering fraud alerts. "We have evidence, Your Honor," Blackwood announced, pulling a thick stack of documents from his briefcase. "These are emails and internal memos, dating back 3 years, showing Mr. Thorne's direct involvement in high-level decision-making at Orionis. They prove his intellectual property is embedded in the very DNA of the company's recent success." He handed the stack to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Vance. I did not need to look at them to know what they were. They were forgeries. Good ones, likely created by the same hacker Julian had paid to scrub his credit history before we met. They would have timestamps, digital signatures, perhaps even fragments of real conversations taken out of context and woven into a fabric of lies. A ripple of murmurs went through the gallery behind me. The courtroom was packed. My divorce was high profile. The press vultures were lined up in the back row, their pens scratching furiously against notepads. I could hear the whispers. 50% of Orionis, that is billions. I heard he really was the brains behind the operation. She looks cold. Doesn't she, Ice Queen? The public narrative was shifting in real time. To them, I was the cold, unfeeling corporate titan, and Julian was the charming, neglected husband who had been used and discarded. It was a narrative Julian had been planting in the tabloids for months through anonymous sources. Judge Vance peered at the documents, his brow furrowed. He looked from the papers to me, then back to the papers. "These are significant claims, Mr. Blackwood," the judge rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding together. "If valid, they would indeed challenge the validity of the prenuptial agreement based on the contribution of assets post-marriage." "Exactly, Your Honor," Blackwood beamed, sensing blood in the water. "The prenuptial agreement signed 5 years ago is obsolete because the nature of the partnership changed. It became a business partnership as much as a romantic one. To deny Mr. Thorne his share is to deny justice." Julian turned his head slightly, locking eyes with me for the first time since the proceedings began. The sad, puppy dog mask slipped for a fraction of a second, just long enough for only me to see. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. It was a look of pure, unadulterated malice. His lips moved, barely forming sound, but I read the words as clearly as if he had screamed them. "You cannot win, Layla." My hand, resting on my lap beneath the heavy oak table, clenched into a fist. My nails dug into my palm, sharp and grounding. The pain was good. It kept me focused. He thought I was trembling with rage or fear. He thought the silence from my side of the table was the silence of defeat. Beside me, Eleanor Sterling sat like a statue carved from granite. She was 60 years old, a legend in contract law, and she had not said a single word in the last 20 minutes. She had not objected to the hearsay. She had not objected to the emotional manipulation. She had simply sat there, hands folded over a sleek leather folder, watching Blackwood and Julian dig their own graves. Her silence was unnerving to the opposition. I saw Blackwood glance at her nervously, waiting for the counterattack that wasn't coming. They were expecting a dogfight. They were expecting me to scream, to deny, to throw papers. But I was not a chaotic storm. I was the climate that caused the storm. I looked at Julian and felt a strange sensation wash over me. It was not sorrow. It was not the heartbreak of a woman losing the love of her life. That love had died the day I found the receipt for a diamond bracelet that never appeared on my wrist. No, what I felt was a cold, Clinical detachment. I was a scientist looking at a pathogen under a microscope. Julian was a virus that had infected my life, my home, and my company. And today was sterilization day. "Does the defense have anything to say regarding these claims?" Judge Vance asked, looking over his glasses at Eleanor. "Ms. Sterling, your client is facing a potential loss of half her fortune." Eleanor turned to me. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a quiet confidence. She gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. It was time. The stage had been set. The actors had said their lines. The villain had monologued. I stood up. The sound of my chair legs scraping against the floor echoed loudly in the silent room. I smoothed the front of my jacket. I did not look at the cameras. I did not look at Blackwood. I looked directly at Judge Vance, and then I let my gaze slide slowly, deliberately, to Julian. He was still holding his pose, but I saw the slight tension in his jaw. He was waiting for me to beg. He was waiting for me to offer a settlement to keep his dirty lies out of the public record. He thought he had me cornered. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, projecting to the back of the room without shouting. It was the voice I used to address shareholders, the voice I used to close deals worth $300 million. "I do not only object to these claims, I find them to be a work of fiction so elaborate they belong in a bookstore, not a court of law." The whispers in the gallery stopped. "Mr. Thorne claims he is a victim," I continued. Stepping out from behind the table, I walked slowly toward the center of the aisle. "He claims he is the architect of my success. He claims his heart is broken." I stopped and turned to face Julian fully. "But Mr. Thorne has forgotten that, in the world of business, as in life, one should never sign a document they have not read, and one should certainly never underestimate the person they share a bed with." Julian's brow furrowed. This was not the script he had written for me. "I am not here to argue with his lies, Your Honor," I said, turning back to the judge. "I am here to end them. I want to show you the true face of this man, not the face he wears for the cameras, and certainly not the face he wears for you today." I reached into my leather tote bag, which had been sitting by my feet. My fingers brushed against the cool, smooth paper of the yellow envelope. It felt heavy, not with weight, but with consequence. Inside that envelope was the timeline of a con artist. Inside was the proof that Julian Thorne did not exist, that the man sitting there was a collage of stolen identities and bad debts. Inside was the lever that would open the trap door beneath his feet. I pulled the envelope out. It was a dark, mustard yellow, sealed with a simple red string. I saw Julian's eyes flick to it. He frowned. He didn't know what it was. He was scanning his memory, wondering if he had left a bank statement lying around, or if I had found a text message. But he wasn't afraid yet. He was just confused. "Ms. Foxworth," Judge Vance said, his tone warning, "this court does not appreciate theatrics. If you have evidence, present it. If you have a statement, make it." "I have both, Your Honor," I replied. I walked forward and placed the envelope on the judge's high bench. The sound of it landing was soft, a mere whisper of paper against wood, but it felt like the click of a gun being cocked. "Mr. Thorne wants 50%, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming colder, harder. "He wants to take credit for my empire, but before you consider his request, I would like you to read the document inside, and I would like Mr. Thorne to tell the court if he remembers the name Gary Miller." The air left the room. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the plaintiff's table. It wasn't Blackwood, it was Julian. The color drained from his face so fast, it looked like a physical blow. The smug, triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, primal terror. The predator had just realized the cage door was closed, and he was on the inside. Judge Vance looked at Julian, noting the sudden change in demeanor, then looked down at the envelope. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering over the red string. "Gary Miller," the judge repeated, his eyebrows raising. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, returning to my seat and folding my hands. "The man who died, metaphorically speaking, 10 years ago in Florida so that Julian Thorne could be born." Julian started to stand up. his movements jerky. "Objection," he blurted out, bypassing his lawyer entirely. This is irrelevant. This is an ambush." "Sit down, Mr. Thorne," Judge Vance snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "I will determine what is relevant." The judge picked up the envelope. He unwound the red string. The sound was distinct in the silence. I watched Julian. He was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. He looked at me, pleading now, his eyes wide with panic. "Don't do this," his eyes said. "We can make a deal." But I just looked at him, and for the first time that morning, I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of the executioner. Judge Vance pulled out the contents. To understand the magnitude of the betrayal, one must understand the landscape of my life 5 years ago. I was 33 years old, and I was drowning in the deep end of an ocean called grief. The sudden death of my parents in a private plane crash had not just orphaned me, it had strapped me into the pilot seat of Orionis Systems, a multi-billion-dollar entity that wanted to eat me alive. The board of directors, mostly gray-haired men who had played golf with my father, looked at me with a mixture of pity and predatory hunger. They saw a grieving daughter they could manipulate, a placeholder CEO they could eventually oust. I was wealthy beyond comprehension, living in a penthouse that touched the clouds. Yet I had never known a silence as loud as the one that filled my life back then. It was a cold, echoing isolation where every handshake felt like a transaction, and every smile felt like a strategy. That was the wounded animal Julian Thorne found at a charity auction in New York City. I remember the night vividly. I was standing in front of an abstract expressionist painting, a chaotic swirl of blacks and angry reds. Holding a glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking, I felt like the painting looked fractured. Then, a voice appeared at my shoulder, low and rich, smelling of expensive cologne and confidence. "It looks like a scream trapped in canvas, doesn't it?" I turned to see him, Julian. He was devastatingly handsome, in that classic, old Hollywood way. He wore a tuxedo that fit him as if he had been born in it. But it was his eyes that caught me. They were dark, warm, and seemingly filled with an empathy I had been starving for. He didn't look at the diamond choker around my neck or the couture gown that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. He looked right at the dark circles I had tried to hide with concealer. "I am Julian," he said, extending a hand, "and you look like you would rather be anywhere else in the world than here." He introduced himself as a venture capitalist, a man who moved money around the globe, investing in dreams. He spoke of art, of vintage wines, of the burden of legacy. He told me he had lost his father young, too. It was a lie. Of course, his father was a mechanic in New Jersey who was very much alive and wondering why his son never called but at that moment. It was the key that unlocked my fortress. He did not approach me as a fan or a subordinate. He approached me as an equal, a fellow traveler on the lonely road of the elite. In the months that followed, Julian executed a masterclass in psychological infiltration. He was the antidote to my stress, when the board meetings left me shaking with rage. Julian was there with a getaway car. He did not take me to the places everyone expected, the Michelin-starred restaurants where we would be photographed. No, he took me on private picnics in hidden coves along the Hudson, or weekend drives to obscure vineyards where we were the only guests. "We do not need the noise, Layla," he would say, pouring a vintage Cabernet into a crystal glass he had packed in a wicker basket. "We have enough noise in our work. With me, I want you to have silence." He created an illusion of parody. He never let me pay. He pulled out a black credit card with a flourish, dismissing the bill before I could even reach for my purse. I did not know then that the black card was linked to a shell company drowning in debt, or that the vintage wine was bought with money he had swindled from a widow in Connecticut. I only saw a man who was secure enough in himself to take care of me. Slowly, methodically, he began to prune the branches of my life. He would listen to me complain about my college friends, about their questions regarding the company, and he would sigh, shaking his head with a sad smile. "They do not understand you, Layla," he would whisper, stroking my hair as I lay my head on his chest. They look at you and they see the money. They see the CEO. They are jealous of your strength. They drain you. You need people who love the real Layla, the Layla who likes trashy reality TV and eats popcorn for dinner. He made himself the gatekeeper of my sanity. One by one, I stopped returning calls. I declined invitations. I narrowed my world until it was just Layla and Julian, an island of two. He was the only one who understood. He was the only one who didn't want anything from me, or so I thought. He was generous to a fault. I remember coming home to find a limited edition handbag waiting on my bed, or a rare first edition book I had mentioned in passing. Just because, the note would say, it was intoxicating. I had spent my life wondering if people liked me or my bank account. Julian made me feel like the money was an inconvenience we both had to tolerate. Later, when the forensic accountants went through the debris of our marriage, I would learn that the handbag was a high-quality counterfeit from Canal Street, and the book was stolen from a library archive. But at the time, they were artifacts of love. The proposal was a scene ripped straight from a romance novel, directed by a man who knew exactly what the audience wanted. He took me to Italy, to a cliffside restaurant in Positano, overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. The sun was setting, painting the water in hues of violet and gold. The air smelled of lemon and salt. He got down on one knee. His hands were trembling, a nice touch of nerves to sell the authenticity. He pulled out a velvet box. Inside sat a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, a ring that looked like it belonged in the crown jewels. "I cannot promise to fix the world for you, Layla," he said, his voice choking with emotion. "But I promise you will never have to face it alone again. Marry me. Let me carry the weight with you." I looked at him, and I didn't see a con man. I saw a life raft. I saw a future where I wasn't just the lonely girl in the ivory tower. I said yes. I cried, and I said yes. And I let him slip the ring onto my finger. It felt heavy. I should have taken that as a warning. The only friction came from my family's lawyer, Eleanor Sterling. She had served my father for 30 years, and she possessed a nose for rats that was unparalleled. When the topic of the prenuptial agreement came up, I wanted to waive it. I felt it was an insult to Julian's integrity, an insult to the equal standing he had worked so hard to establish. He has his own money. "Eleanor," I argued in her office, pacing the floor, "he is a venture capitalist. He does not need my fortune. Making him sign a prenup makes it look like a transaction." Eleanor had simply looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "Layla, you are a walking economy. You do not get married without insurance. If he loves you, he will sign it. If he loves your portfolio, he will fight it." I went home, terrified to bring it up. I thought Julian would be offended. I thought he would leave. But when I stammered out the request, handing him the thick legal document with shaking hands, he didn't get angry. He laughed. He took the document, flipped to the back page without reading a single clause, and uncapped his fountain pen. "Is this what you were worried about?" he asked, his eyes crinkling with amusement. He signed his name with a flourish, Julian Thorne, and tossed the papers onto the coffee table like they were junk mail. "This paper is meaningless, Layla," he said, pulling me into his arms and kissing my forehead. "It is just ink. I am never going to leave you. I would sign 1,000 of these if it made you feel safe. My money is yours, and yours is yours. We are partners." It was the ultimate psychological checkmate. By showing zero interest in the money, he convinced me completely that he didn't want it. I felt guilty for even asking. I felt like I was the cynical one, the damaged one, and he was the pure-hearted hero. The wedding was dubbed the event of the decade. We rented a historic castle in the Scottish Highlands. Senators, tech moguls, and celebrities filled the pews. I walked down the aisle in a gown that had taken 400 hours to stitch, towards a man who looked at me with tears in his eyes. I felt triumphant. I had survived the loss of my parents, and I had found my soulmate. The cracks, however, appeared sooner than I could have imagined. In fact, the first hairline fracture happened on our wedding night. The reception had ended. We had retired to the bridal suite, A massive stone room with a roaring fireplace. I had gone into the bathroom to change out of my gown. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. As I was unclasping the pearls from my neck, I heard Julian's voice. He wasn't speaking to me. He was on the phone. And the voice I heard was not the cultured, soft-spoken baritone of Julian the venture capitalist. It was sharper, rougher, with a cadence that sounded almost streetwise. "Yeah, it is done," he was saying. "Relax. All right, I told you I would close the deal. We are in... No, the prenup is a joke. I played the long game. Just keep the creditors off my back for another month until I get access to the joint accounts. Yeah, we are set for life, baby." I froze. My hand hovered over the necklace. The words bounced around my skull. Close the deal. Creditors. Set for life. I stepped out of the bathroom. Julian spun around. In a split second, the rough sneer dropped from his face, replaced instantly by that warm, loving smile I adored. He hung up the phone and tossed it onto the bed. "Just wrapping up a business call, darling," he said, walking over to me. "Some investors get nervous when I'm out of the country. I told them not to worry, that I'm the happiest man alive." He kissed me, and his lips felt warm. I looked into his eyes, searching for the monster I thought I had just heard, but there was only Julian, my husband. I told myself I was crazy. I told myself I was exhausted, that the champagne and the stress of the wedding had made me hallucinate. I told myself I had misheard him. Who calls their wife a deal? Who talks about creditors on their wedding night? It didn't make sense. I pushed the doubt down, deep into the darkest corner of my mind. I buried it under the layers of hope and desperation. I wanted the fairy tale so badly that I chose to be deaf. I smiled back at him, let him lead me to the bed, and started my life as Mrs. Julian Thorne. But deep down, in the place where instinct lives, a small, cold voice whispered that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. And as I sat in the courtroom 5 years later, watching him sweat, I realized that voice had been the only honest thing in our entire marriage. The erosion of my life did not happen all at once like a landslide. It happened in slow, agonizing increments, like water dripping onto stone until the rock finally cracks. The first year of our marriage was a masterclass in boundary dissolution. It began with Orionis systems. Initially, Julian had played the role of the supportive spouse who knew his place. Content to listen to my vented frustrations over a glass of Merlot in the evenings. But 3 months after the honeymoon, the narrative shifted. He began to complain about boredom. He spoke of unused potential and how it pained him to see me shouldering the burden of the company alone when he had so much expertise to offer. "I do not want a salary, Layla," he said one morning over breakfast, buttering his toast with aggressive precision. "I just want to help. Give me a title. Let me be your eyes and ears where you cannot be. Let me be the external affairs advisor. It sounds official, but it costs the company nothing." It seemed reasonable. I was exhausted, fighting battles on 3 different continents, and the idea of having a trusted lieutenant, my husband, no less felt like a relief. I signed the appointment letter. It was the moment I invited the fox into the henhouse. Julian wasted no time. He used the title not to advise me, but to construct a personal fiefdom. He began attending galas and industry mixers without me, handing out business cards that bore the Orionis logo but his personal cell number. He charmed investors, flirted with the wives of senators, and, as I would later discover, used the perceived authority of his position to secure private loans. He told creditors that he was a silent partner in Orionis, that his equity was hidden for tax purposes, and that any loan given to him was effectively backed by my billions. Then came the financial gaslighting. We had a joint account for household expenses maintenance for the penthouse, staff salaries, travel. I kept it well funded, usually with a balance of around $200,000. Ideally, that amount should have lasted months. Under Julian's watch, it evaporated in weeks. When I first noticed a withdrawal of $12,000 for consulting services that I didn't recognize, I asked him about it. He looked up from his tablet, his expression one of wounded incredulity. That was for an introduction fee to a potential partner in Dubai. Layla, I am building bridges for you. Do you have any idea how much energy I am putting into expanding your network? And you are grilling me over 12 grand like I am a teenager stealing from his mother's purse. It is not the amount, Julian, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. It is the lack of transparency. Who is this partner? You are being paranoid, he snapped, standing up and pacing the room. This is exactly what your problem is. You are so used to people using you that you cannot trust the one person who is actually trying to help. You are suffocating me. Layla, you are treating me like an employee, not a husband. It is insulting. I ended up apologizing. I transferred another $50,000 into the account to prove I trusted him. That was how the cycle worked. He would do something wrong. I would question it. He would attack my character, and I would pay to fix the rift between us. The emotional abuse was subtler, woven into the fabric of our daily interactions. He began to curate me. Are you wearing that to the board meeting? He would ask, leaning against the doorframe as I adjusted my blazer. What is wrong with it? Nothing, he would say with a shrug. If you want to look like a middle management secretary, I just thought the CEO of Orionis would want to project a bit more power, but wear what makes you happy. I would change the outfit. He started checking my phone. If I received a text after 9 in the evening, he would demand to know who it was. He claimed it was because he was protective, that he worried about men taking advantage of me. He isolated me further, planting seeds of doubt about my few remaining friends. Did you hear the tone in Sarah's voice when she congratulated you on the merger? He would whisper. She is jealous, Layla. She wants you to fail. Eventually, I stopped seeing Sarah. I stopped seeing everyone. The infidelity was a ghost that haunted the periphery of my vision. There were nights he didn't come home, citing late negotiations or networking drinks that ran into the early hours. He would return smelling of perfume that wasn't mine, something floral and cheap, but if I mentioned it, he would produce a receipt for a private booth at a cigar bar and claim the scent must have rubbed off from the waitresses. Then, the gifts would come, a diamond tennis bracelet, a vintage Rolex. He would cry, actual tears streaming down his face, telling me how much he loved me and how hurt he was that I doubted his fidelity. I am doing this all for us, he would sob, burying his face in my neck. Why can't you see that? I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him, because if I didn't, I had to admit that I had married a stranger. The breaking point, the moment the blindfold was violently ripped from my eyes, happened 18 months into the marriage. It involved a painting. My parents had been avid art collectors, and the pride of their collection was a small, vibrant oil painting by a lesser-known impressionist. Hanging in the hallway of the penthouse, it wasn't a museum piece worth hundreds of millions, but it was appraised at roughly $350,000. More importantly, it was the first piece of art my mother had ever bought. I loved it. I passed it every morning and touched the frame for luck. One Tuesday afternoon, I came home early with a migraine. The penthouse was silent. As I walked down the hallway, the afternoon light hit the painting. Something was wrong. I stopped. The texture of the canvas looked too smooth. The brushstrokes, which I knew by heart, lacked the chaotic impasto depth of the original. The signature in the corner was a millimeter too high. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I ran to my study and grabbed a magnifying glass. I returned to the painting and examined the cracking pattern of the paint, the craquelure. On the original, the cracks were spiderwebs of age, filled with decades of dust. On this painting, the cracks looked painted on, dark lines drawn with a fine-tipped brush to mimic age. It was a fake, a high-quality reproduction, but a fake nonetheless. I sat on the floor, staring at it, my mind racing. Who could have done this? We had high-level security. No one entered the penthouse without biometric clearance. Then the front door opened. Julian walked in, humming a tune, tossing his keys into the bowl. He froze when he saw me sitting on the floor in the hallway. "Layla," he said, his voice cautious, "you are home early." I stood up slowly. Where is it, Julian? Where is what? He feigned ignorance, but I saw his eyes dart to the painting and then quickly away. The painting, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. This is a fake. Where is the real one? For a moment, I thought he would deny it. I expected the gaslighting script. You are crazy. It is the lighting. You are having a migraine. But he didn't. He looked at me, and his face changed. The handsome, charming mask dissolved, revealing a sneer of pure contempt. I sold it, he said, his voice flat. You sold it, I whispered. You stole it and you sold it. I liquidated an asset, he shouted, the explosion of anger sudden and terrifying. He took a step toward me, looming over me. Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain the lifestyle you expect of me? You give me an allowance like a child. I have needs. Layla, I have investments that require capital. I took a stupid painting that you just walk past every day and I put the money to work. You should be thanking me for being proactive instead of hoarding dead assets on a wall. He was blaming me. He had stolen a piece of my family history, replaced it with a forgery, and he was screaming at me for being stingy. Who did you sell it to? I asked, my voice icy. It does not matter, he yelled. It is gone, and do not you dare make a scene about this. If you tell anyone, you will humiliate yourself. Imagine the headlines, billionaire CEO calls police on husband over a picture. You will look petty. You will look unstable. He stormed past me into the bedroom and slammed the door. I stood there in the hallway, shaking, but I wasn't shaking from fear anymore. I was shaking from the sheer, cold clarity that had just descended upon me. He was not a bad husband. He was a criminal. The next morning, I did not confront him. I apologized. I told him he was right, that I was being materialistic, and that I trusted his judgment. I watched him smirk, satisfied that he had broken me once again. 2 hours later, I was in a nondescript diner in Queens, sitting across from a man named Frank O'Connor. Frank was a former FBI agent who had done security consulting for my father years ago. He was the kind of man who didn't exist on social media and who accepted payment only in cash or gold. I need to know who he is. Frank, I said, sliding a manila envelope with Julian's photo and social security number across the greasy table. Not who he says he is, who he actually is. Frank took the envelope, looked at the photo, and grunted. Give me 48 hours. 48 hours later, Frank met me in my car in the parking lot of a closed shopping mall. He didn't say a word. He just handed me a thick dossier. I opened it, and my world disintegrated. The man I knew as Julian Thorne did not exist. The social security number he used belonged to a man who had died in a car accident in 1998. His real name was Gary Miller. I flipped through the pages, reading a history that read like a tragic novel. Born in Tampa, Florida. First arrest at 19 for check fraud. Second arrest at 22 for identity theft. Then came the victims. There was a woman in Chicago, a dermatologist, who had lost her practice after Julian, then calling himself Sebastian, convinced her to invest in a non-existent medical startup. There was a widow in Savannah who had mortgaged her house to pay for his gambling debts before he vanished in the middle of the night. There were bankruptcies in 3 different states. There were civil judgments totaling over $4 million that he had never paid. And then, the most chilling detail, a police report from a domestic disturbance in Ohio. 5 years prior, the victim, his then-girlfriend, had claimed he threatened to kill her if she left him. The charges were dropped when she suddenly refused to testify. I looked at the photo of Gary Miller's mugshot from 10 years ago. He was younger, his hair less styled, but the eyes were the same, the eyes of a predator. He is a pro, Layla, Frank said quietly from the driver's seat. He finds women who are vulnerable, wealthy, lonely, or grieving. He mirrors them. He becomes whatever they need him to be. Then he bleeds them dry. Usually, he waits until he has access to the liquid cash, drains the accounts, and disappears. But with you, he hit the mother lode. He is not going to just run. He is going to try to take half the kingdom. I closed the dossier. My hands were steady. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was sleeping next to a monster. I was married to a man who saw me not as a person, but as a harvest. "What do you want to do?" Frank asked. "I can get this to the cops. We can have him arrested for identity fraud by dinner time." I looked out the window at the rain streaking the glass. If I arrested him now, it would be a scandal. Oriona's stock would plummet. The board would use the chaos to argue that my judgment was compromised, that I was unfit to lead because I had let a con man into the inner sanctum. I would lose my company. And Gary Miller. He would get a few years in a minimum security prison, maybe write a book, and come out to do it again. No, prison was too good for him. I didn't want him just gone. I wanted him destroyed. I wanted to dismantle him piece by piece, just as he had tried to dismantle me. "No police," I said, turning to Frank. "Not yet." "You are going to stay with him?" Frank asked, shocked. "I am going to play the role he wrote for me," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "I am going to be the naive, submissive wife. I am going to let him think he has won. I am going to let him get confident. Frank, I want him so arrogant that he stops looking over his shoulder." I looked down at the mugshot of Gary Miller one last time. "He wants to play a game of chess," I whispered. "Fine, but he doesn't know that I own the board." I drove home that night and cooked Julian his favorite dinner. When he came in, smelling of that cheap floral perfume, I kissed him and asked him how his day was. I listened to him lie about a meeting with investors. I smiled, I nodded, and all the while, I was planning his funeral. The evolution of Julian Thorne, or rather, the regression of Gary Miller, accelerated in ways that I had not anticipated. Once he realized that his access to the liquid cash in our joint accounts was finite, his ambition mutated. He stopped being satisfied with siphoning off thousands. He began to hunger for millions, and in the world of biotechnology, millions are not found in bank accounts. They are found in intellectual property. Oriona's Systems was on the verge of a breakthrough. We called it the Genesis Protocol, a gene-editing sequence capable of repairing damaged neural tissue. It was the holy grail of modern medicine, and its patent alone was worth more than the GDP of several small countries. I had kept the details under the tightest security, encrypted on servers that required retina scans to access, but Julian, in his role as the external affairs advisor, had been sniffing around the R&D department like a bloodhound. He made his move in early November. It was subtle, buried in a stack of legitimate paperwork. He brought me a pile of documents to sign late one Tuesday evening: charitable donation authorizations, tax write-off confirmations, and routine estate maintenance forms. "Just the boring stuff, darling," he said, placing a steaming mug of herbal tea on my desk. "I know you hate the admin work, so I highlighted the signature lines for you. Drink your tea. You look exhausted." The tea smelled of chamomile and peppermint, but beneath the aromatic steam, my nose caught a faint, metallic scent. It was a smell I associated with chemical labs, not kitchen pantries. I looked at Julian. He was hovering, his eyes fixated not on me, but on the mug. "Thanks, Julian," I said, offering a tired smile. "I will get to these in a minute. Can you run me a bath?" "Of course," he said, kissing the top of my head. "Do not let the tea get cold." As soon as he left the room, I poured the contents of the mug into the potted fiddle-leaf fig in the corner. Then, I took a small sample of the residue at the bottom of the cup and smeared it onto a glass slide from my home microscope kit. I did not need a lab to tell me what it was, but I sent a blood sample to Dr. Aris, my private physician, the next morning just to be certain. The results came back 2 hours later. Benzodiazepines, a mild dose, enough to induce lethargy, confusion, and suggestibility, but not enough to knock me out completely. He was drugging me. He wanted me pliable. He wanted me to sign without reading. I looked at the paperwork he had given me. Buried between a donation to the Opera House and a landscaping contract was a transfer of assignment deed. It authorized the transfer of the Genesis Protocol's preliminary ownership to a holding company called Apex Ventures. I felt a cold rage settle in my stomach. This was not just theft. This was an attempt to dismantle my life's work. I did not sign it. I forged my own signature, a version that looked authentic to the naked eye, but had a specific flaw in the loop of the L that my lawyers knew to identify as a sign of duress or forgery. Then I left the papers for him to find. I needed him to think he had succeeded. I needed him to feel safe. But safety was a luxury I was about to strip from him entirely. That weekend, while Julian was away on a golf trip in the Hamptons, I turned our penthouse into a panopticon. I did not hire a security firm. That would leave a paper trail. I did it myself. I installed pinhole cameras in the crown molding of every room. I placed audio bugs in his home office, under his desk, and even inside the casing of his favorite espresso machine. I installed a keylogger on his laptop and cloned his phone's SIM card using a piece of tech developed by my own cybersecurity division. By Monday morning, I was no longer just his wife. I was the operator of a surveillance state, and Julian was my only citizen. The data began to flow in, and the picture it painted was even uglier than I had imagined. Apex Ventures was not just a holding company. It was a shell entity registered in the Cayman Islands. But the IP address accessing its accounts was local. I traced the digital footprint back to a laptop, not Julian's laptop. It traced back to the laptop of Monica Reeves, my executive assistant. My stomach churned. Monica had been with me for 3 years. She knew my schedule, my passwords, my coffee order, and my deepest professional insecurities. I had trusted her. I switched the video feed to the camera I had installed in Julian's study. I watched the recording from the previous Friday. Julian was sitting in his leather chair, a glass of scotch in hand. The door opened, and Monica walked in. She wasn't wearing her office attire. She was wearing a silk robe that I recognized it was mine. "Did she sign it?" Monica asked, sitting on the edge of the desk. "She signed it," Julian grinned, holding up the forged document. "She was so out of it she would have signed a confession to murder if I asked her to. The Genesis Protocol is ours, baby. Or, at least, it will be once we broker the sale to Biocorp." Biocorp. Monica laughed. "They are Orionis's biggest competitor. Layla will lose her mind." "Layla will be too broke to care," Julian said, pulling Monica close. "Once we sell the IP and I divorce her, we are looking at $50 million. Clean, plus half of whatever is left of her estate." I watched them toast to my destruction. I did not cry. I did not throw the monitor across the room. I sat in the darkness of my command center, bathed in the blue light of the screens, and I began to calculate. I could have fired Monica on the spot. I could have had security drag her out of the building, but a known spy is far more valuable than a banished one. If Julian was using Monica to get information on me, I could use Monica to feed information to him. I initiated Operation Mirage. I began to manufacture a crisis. I created a series of false financial reports, internal memos, and confidential emails. I painted a picture of a company in freefall. According to these fabricated documents, Orionis Systems was not on the verge of a breakthrough. It was on the verge of a liquidity crisis. The clinical trials for our other drugs had failed. The FDA was investigating us for fraud. The stock was about to be delisted. I left a red folder marked Eyes Only, Insolvency Strategy, on my desk one afternoon when I knew I had a lunch meeting. I made sure Monica was the only one with access to the office. The trap was baited. When I returned, the folder was exactly where I had left it, but a single hair I had placed on the seal was gone. She had opened it. She had photographed it. By that evening, the information had reached Julian. I watched him on the hidden camera in the living room. He was pacing, phone to his ear, his face a mask of panic. "What do you mean she is broke?" he hissed into the phone. "I saw the numbers last month. A federal investigation if the FDA shuts them down. The stock is worth zero. Zero. Monica. No. The Genesis Protocol won't matter if the company assets are frozen by the government. We need to get out. Now." He was panicking. The rat sensed the ship was sinking, and his instinct was not to save it, but to grab the cheese and jump. "I need to trigger the divorce before the news breaks," Julian said, running a hand through his hair. "If I file now, the valuation is based on last quarter's earnings. If I wait until the bankruptcy is public, I get half of nothing." He hung up and immediately dialed another number. I knew this number. It belonged to Marcus Blackwood. "Marcus," Julian said, his voice shaking with urgency, "it is time. We are moving up the timeline. I want to file the papers this week. Yes, I know the prenup is ironclad. That is why I pay you. Find a loophole. Claim coercion. Claim I was mentally incapacitated when I signed it. I do not care what you have to invent. Just get me my 50% of the assets as they stand today, not what they will be worth next month." I leaned back in my chair, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. He was accelerating his timeline based on a hallucination I had created. He was rushing into battle without checking his ammunition. He thought he was running from a collapsing building, but he was actually running straight into a cage. The next morning, I made a call of my own. "Eleanor," I said when my lawyer picked up, "he is making his move." "Are you sure?" Eleanor Sterling's voice was calm, sharp as a razor. "I am watching him draft the asset demand list right now," I replied, looking at the keylogger data stream on my screen. "He is going to claim he was the strategic mind behind the company. He is going to claim the prenup was signed under duress. He is hiring Marcus Blackwood." "Blackwood is a pit bull," Eleanor mused. "He is dirty, loud, and expensive. He will try to intimidate us with volume and fabricated scandal." "Let him," I said. "I want them to feel confident. I want them to think I am weak, distracted, and protecting a dying company. When we walk into that courtroom, I want Julian to believe he has already won." "And the insurance policy?" Eleanor asked. "The yellow envelope is ready," I said. "And I have the secondary document, the one he forgot about." "Good," Eleanor said. "Layla, once we start this, there is no turning back. You are going to have to let him humiliate you in the filings. You are going to have to let the press run stories that he is the victim. You have to hold the line until the very last second. I have been holding the line for 5 years. Eleanor," I said, looking at the screen where Julian was currently practicing his sad husband face in the mirror. "I can hold it for a few more weeks." I hung up the phone. I walked out of my office and saw Monica typing away at her desk. She looked up and smiled that bright, treacherous smile. "Can I get you anything, Ms. Foxworth?" she asked. "No, thank you, Monica," I said, my voice pleasant. "Actually, yes. Make a reservation for 2 at Le Bernardin for tonight. I want to celebrate." "Celebrate?" she asked, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "Celebrate what?" "The future," I said enigmatically. "It is going to be full of surprises." I walked away, leaving her to wonder if I was delusional. In a way, I was celebrating. I was celebrating the end. The spider had spun his web, thinking he was the predator, but he had failed to notice that he had spun it inside the mouth of a much larger, much more patient beast. And now, the jaws were beginning to close. Warfare is rarely about the noise of battle. It is about the silence of preparation. While Julian was busy mentally spending a fortune he had not yet stolen, I was busy ensuring that fortune would vanish like smoke the moment he reached for it. The first step was the asset migration. I could not simply hide money. Forensic accountants would find it in a heartbeat. I had to move it legally, transparently, and yet completely out of his reach. I utilized a clause in my family trust that allowed for philanthropic acceleration. Over the course of 3 days, I transferred 70% of my liquid assets, roughly $400 million, into irrevocable charitable trusts. These trusts were legally distinct entities. The beneficiaries were orphanages in Southeast Asia and medical research foundations in Europe. Technically, I no longer owned that money. I was merely the trustee advisor. If Julian wanted half, he would have to sue a cancer ward in Zurich. Next came the bait. Julian needed to believe he had a silver bullet to kill the prenuptial agreement. He needed to believe that his victory was a legal certainty, not a gamble. I spent a night in my office forging a document. I took a copy of our original prenup and digitally altered a single clause. I changed the jurisdiction code from State of Massachusetts to State of Massachusetts, a deliberate typo. Then, I added a drafting error note from a fictional paralegal in the margins, circling the typo and writing warning, this jurisdictional error could invalidate the entire contract if challenged. I printed this compromised version on slightly aged paper and slipped it into a hidden safe in our bedroom closet. The one safe I knew Julian had cracked 6 months ago because I had accidentally left the combination on my bedside table. The trap was sprung less than 24 hours later. Through the hidden camera in the bedroom, I watched him open the safe while I was in the shower. I saw him pull out the document. I saw his eyes widen as he read the marginal note. A grin spread across his face, predatory and triumphant. He took a photo of the page with his phone, then carefully placed it back, thinking he was the smartest man in the room. "Got you," he whispered. 10 minutes later, he was on the phone with Marcus Blackwood. "The prenup is garbage. Marcus, it has a fatal clerical error. Jurisdiction is misspelled. The whole thing is void. We can go for the throat." He had swallowed the hook, line, and sinker. The final act of my performance before the curtain fell was our 5th wedding anniversary party. It was a gala held at the Mandarin Oriental, a spectacle of excess intended to serve as the perfect backdrop for his betrayal. I wore a gown of silver silk that shimmered like mercury. Playing the role of the doting, oblivious wife to perfection, I held his arm. I laughed at his jokes. I toasted to our eternal partnership while looking into eyes that I knew were already calculating my demise. But the guests were not just socialites and business partners. Scattered among the crowd were 3 men and 2 women who looked like wealthy investors, but were. In fact, private investigators and forensic audio specialists I had hired. They were wired for sound. Julian, emboldened by his discovery of the prenup error and perhaps a bit too much vintage scotch, began to get sloppy. He huddled in a corner with a group of men he assumed were Wall Street sharks, actually my operatives. The wife, I heard his voice clearly through the earpiece I wore disguised as a diamond earring. She is a sweet girl, but let's just say the engine light has been blinking for a while. She is unstable. Honestly, I am just trying to get out with enough to start my own firm. I carried that company for 5 years. I deserve a payout. "Sounds like you have a plan," one of the operatives prodded. "Oh, I have more than a plan," Julian laughed, clinking his glass against theirs. "I have a winning lottery ticket. By this time next week, I will be a free man with a 9-figure bank account, and she will be lucky if I let her keep the cats." He laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. Every word was recorded, digitized, and uploaded to a secure server before he even finished his drink. The hangover came the next morning, but not for him. At 9 o'clock, while I was drinking coffee in the breakfast nook, a process server rang the doorbell. He handed me a thick envelope. "You have been served, Mrs. Thorne," he said. I opened it, divorce papers, and not just a request for separation. It was a declaration of war. Julian came down the stairs, wearing a suit, carrying a suitcase. He didn't look at me with love or even pity. He looked at me with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. "I filed this morning," he said, adjusting his cuffs. "I have also frozen our joint accounts, and per the emergency motion my lawyer filed, I am requesting exclusive use of the marital residence until the proceedings are over. You need to leave. Layla." He was kicking me out of my own house. "Julian," I whispered, letting my voice tremble. "What are you doing, Guille?" "Because I cannot do this anymore." He sighed, a theatrically weary sound. "I cannot watch you destroy yourself and drag me down with you. Your behavior lately, the paranoia, the erratic spending, it is too much. I need space. And frankly, the company needs a leader who is mentally sound." He had launched the smear campaign. Within the hour, blind items began appearing on gossip blogs about a tech CEO battling a mental breakdown. Oriona's stock dipped 3%. He was trying to devalue the company so he could argue for a larger share of the distressed assets, or perhaps force the board to remove me so he could step in as a savior. "You are throwing me out?" I asked, looking around the penthouse. "It is for the best," he said, checking his watch. "Go to a hotel. Get some help. We will talk through the lawyers." I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I simply nodded, picked up my purse, and walked out the door. As the elevator doors closed, shutting out the sight of him standing in my foyer like a conquering king, I stopped trembling. I checked my phone. The stock dip was within acceptable parameters. The recordings from the party were processed. The forensic accounting of his embezzlement was finalized. He thought he had exiled me. He didn't realize he had just locked himself in the slaughterhouse. The night before the trial, I sat in a suite at the Four Seasons, not the Ritz, because I wanted to appear humbled, and stared at the yellow envelope on the desk. It contained the original, notarized prenuptial agreement, free of any typos, with a video authentication of the signing ceremony, but that was just the shield. The sword was the second document. It was a piece of paper Julian had signed 3 years ago, in a dimly lit back room of a shady lending house in New Jersey. He had been in deep trouble with a loan shark. He had come to me, weeping, begging for $2 million to save his legs from being broken. I had agreed to pay the debt, but on one condition: he had to sign a post-nuptial waiver and indemnification. In it, he explicitly acknowledged that he had made zero contribution to Oriona's systems, that his debts were his own, and crucially, that in the event of a divorce, he waived all rights to any marital assets in exchange for me clearing his criminal debt. He had signed it without reading it closely, just grateful to be alive. And then, he had watched me burn a copy of it in the fireplace. "It is gone," I had told him then. "A fresh start." But I had burned a copy. The original had been in a safety deposit box in Zurich for 3 years. He had forgotten it existed. He thought the slate was clean. I picked up the phone and dialed Eleanor. "File the supplemental evidence motion," I said, "but do not upload the documents to the portal yet. I want to hand them to Judge Vance personally." "You want the element of surprise," Eleanor noted. "I want to see his face," I corrected. "I want to see the exact moment he realizes that the woman he thought was a sheep was actually the shepherd, and he is just another wolf to be put down." I hung up. Outside, the Boston skyline glittered in the cold night. Somewhere in that city, Julian was probably toasting with Marcus Blackwood, celebrating their impending victory. They were celebrating a check that would never clear, a victory that was already a defeat. I turned off the light. I slept better that night than I had in 5 years. The air in courtroom 4B had shifted. If the morning session was a skirmish, the afternoon session was an all-out blitzkrieg. Marcus Blackwood, Julian's attorney, did not just stand up. He launched himself from his chair like a Doberman slipping its leash. He paced the length of the aisle, his Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor tiles, creating a cadence of aggression that filled the silence. "Your Honor," Blackwood began, his voice booming with the practiced indignation of a man who got paid $1,000 an hour to be outraged. "We have listened to Ms. Foxworth's counsel attempt to paint a picture of a business arrangement, but let us be clear about what actually happened 5 years ago. This was not a meeting of equals. This was a hostile takeover of a human heart." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. I watched a bead of sweat trickle down the back of Julian's neck. He was leaning forward, his elbows on the table, face buried in his hands in a pose of profound sorrow. It was a good pose. It hid his eyes, which I knew were darting around the room, counting the imaginary money he thought he was about to win. "My client," Blackwood continued, gesturing theatrically toward Julian, "was a young, idealistic man in love. He was presented with a document, a prenuptial agreement, 72 hours before the wedding. 72 hours. Your Honor. The invitations were sent, the flights were booked, the guests were arriving in Scotland, and suddenly, he is handed a 50-page legal ultimatum." Blackwood stopped in front of the judge's bench, slamming his hand down on the railing for effect. He was told, implicitly if not explicitly, that if he did not sign, the wedding was off. That is not an agreement. That is duress. That is coercion. Ms. Foxworth used her immense wealth and the social pressure of the event to force Mr. Thorne into signing away his rights. She weaponized his love against him. Judge Vance looked over his spectacles, his face unreadable. Mr. Blackwood, duress is a high bar to clear. Do you have evidence that Mr. Thorne was incapacitated or threatened? We have his testimony, Your Honor, Blackwood said, turning to Julian. Mr. Thorne, please tell the court why you signed that document. Julian stood up slowly. He looked ragged. He had clearly rubbed his eyes to make them red and puffy. He looked at the judge, his chin trembling just enough to be visible from the bench. I signed it because I trusted her, Julian said, his voice cracking. I did not even read it. Your Honor, I truly didn't. I looked at Layla, and I saw the woman I wanted to spend my life with. She told me it was just a formality for the board of directors. She told me— He paused, swallowing hard, as if the memory was too painful to articulate. She told me, Julian, this paper means nothing because we are forever. I believed her. I did not know that she looked at me and saw a potential liability. I did not know she considered me a gold digger from the very first date. He wiped a tear from his cheek. I had to admire the commitment. If he had put this much effort into actual work, he might have been a decent employee. I gave up my career for her, Julian continued, his voice gaining strength, shifting from sorrow to righteous anger. I managed her household. I managed her anxiety. I advised her on the mergers that made her billions. And now she wants to discard me like a used tissue and hide behind a piece of paper I was forced to sign under the threat of public humiliation. Thank you, Mr. Thorne, Blackwood said softly, guiding Julian back to his seat, as if he were an invalid. Then, the lawyer turned back to the judge, his eyes gleaming. But here's the crux of the matter. Your Honor, even if the court ignores the duress, which it should not, the document itself is legally fatally flawed. Blackwood walked back to his table and picked up a document. It was the one I had planted, the one with the typo, the one Julian had photographed in our bedroom closet. Defense Exhibit C, Blackwood announced, handing the papers to the bailiff. This is the copy of the prenuptial agreement retained by Mr. Thorne, if Your Honor will turn to page 42. Paragraph 7, regarding jurisdiction and severability. Judge Vance took the document. He flipped through the pages, the crisp sound amplifying the tension in the room. He stopped at page 42. You will notice, Your Honor, Blackwood said, a smirk playing on his lips, that the jurisdiction is listed as the state of Massachusetts. It is misspelled. Furthermore, there is a marginal note, initialed by the drafting paralegal, acknowledging a drafting error regarding the severability clause. This note explicitly states that the error could invalidate the entire contract. Blackwood paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. A contract with a fundamental error in jurisdiction is not a contract, Your Honor. It is a piece of paper, and without a valid contract. The assets acquired during the marriage are community property, all of them. Judge Vance frowned. He pulled the paper closer, squinting at the text. He looked at the marginal note I had forged. He looked at the misspelling I had inserted. To a strict legal mind like his, these were not just typos. They were evidence of a sloppy, unenforceable agreement. Ms. Sterling, Judge Vance said, looking at my lawyer, are you aware of these errors in the document? Eleanor sat like a stone statue. She did not reach for her microphone. She merely looked at the judge and gave a non-committal tilt of her head. Her silence was deafening. To the room, it looked like we were stunned. It looked like we had been caught. Julian saw this. He saw Eleanor's lack of defense, and he saw the judge's concern. The fear that had gripped him earlier began to evaporate, replaced by the toxic arrogance that was his true nature. He leaned over to Blackwood and whispered something. Blackwood nodded. Your Honor, Blackwood said, his voice ringing with victory. Given that the prenuptial agreement is evidently void, We are moving for immediate relief. My client has been locked out of his home. His accounts have been frozen. He is destitute, while his wife sits on a fortune he helped build. What are you asking for, Mr. Blackwood? The judge asked, sounding weary. We are filing an emergency motion for temporary spousal support, Blackwood said. We are requesting an immediate transfer of $10 million to Mr. Thorne's personal account to cover his legal fees and living expenses commensurate with the marital standard of living. Furthermore, Blackwood paused, and I saw Julian nudge him under the table. Furthermore, Blackwood continued, Mr. Thorne asserts equitable ownership over specific intellectual property developed during the marriage, specifically, the patent known internally as the Genesis Protocol. The gallery gasped. The reporters in the back row began typing furiously. He wasn't just asking for money. He was asking for the crown jewel of Orionis Systems. He was claiming he helped invent the technology that would cure paralysis. Mr. Thorne provided key conceptual frameworks for that technology. Blackwood lied, not batting an eyelash. To deny him his rights to that patent is to rob an inventor of his creation. I sat there, watching them. I watched Julian's chest puff out. He looked at me then. It was a look of pure, unadulterated gloating. He wasn't just winning. He was destroying me. He thought he had found the loophole. He thought the misspelling of a state name was the key to a kingdom worth billions. He wants $10 million by the end of the business day. I thought, the number floating in my mind. And he wants the work of my grandfather, my father, and 300 scientists. The audacity was breathtaking. It was almost beautiful in its completeness. He had stripped away every layer of pretense. There was no loving husband left. There was only a parasite demanding to consume the host. Ms. Foxworth, Judge Vance's voice cut through my thoughts. I looked up. The judge was looking at me, not Eleanor. He seemed annoyed, perhaps even disappointed. He held up the document Blackwood had submitted, the one with the typo. Your counsel has remained silent, which I find unusual given the gravity of these claims, Judge Vance said. So I am asking you directly, do you have an explanation for the defects in this contract? Because as it stands, Mr. Blackwood makes a compelling argument for invalidity. The room went silent. The air conditioning hummed. A fly buzzed somewhere near the ceiling. Julian was grinning openly now. He thought I was paralyzed by shock. He thought I was beaten. I took a breath. I uncrossed my legs. I placed my hands flat on the table. Then I stood up. My chair made no sound. I smoothed the front of my blazer. I did not look at Julian. I did not look at Blackwood. I looked directly at Judge Vance. Your Honor, I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried a clarity that cut through the humidity of the courtroom. I apologize for my counsel's silence. We merely did not want to interrupt Mr. Thorne while he was digging his own grave. Objection, Blackwood shouted, jumping up. Argumentative. Overruled, Judge Vance said sharply. His eyes locked on mine. Continue, Ms. Foxworth. I stepped out from behind the defense table. I walked to the center of the room, standing in the open space between the two tables. I turned slightly so I could see Julian's profile. His grin had faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. The document Mr. Blackwood is holding, I said, gesturing to the papers in the judge's hand, is indeed a document that was in my home. It is a document my husband photographed from a safe he was never supposed to have access to. It is the prenup, Julian blurted out. I turned to him. I offered him a small, polite smile, the kind you give a stranger in an elevator. No, Julian, I said softly. It is a draft from 5 years ago that was rejected by my legal team specifically because of those errors. It was never signed. It was never notarized. It was never executed. It is scrap paper. That is a lie, Julian shouted, standing up. I saw the signature. It has your signature. It has a signature, I corrected him. But if you look closely at the date stamp on the bottom of the page, Your Honor, you will see it is dated October 12th. We were married on October 10th. That document was a revision draft, created post-nuptial for review, which was then discarded. Judge Vance looked at the date. He nodded slowly. But more importantly, I said, turning back to the bench, Mr. Thorne claims he was coerced. He claims he did not read the contract. He claims he is entitled to $10 million and my company because the contract is invalid. I walked back to my table. I reached into my bag and pulled out the yellow envelope I had placed there earlier. The reason I brought this, Your Honor, I said, lifting the envelope, is because the document Mr. Blackwood submitted is a decoy my husband stole because he thought it gave him leverage. I did not steal anything, Julian yelled. She is lying. The real prenuptial agreement, I said, ignoring his outburst, is inside this envelope. It is notarized, it is signed, and it contains no typos. But that is not the only thing inside. I walked up to the bench. I felt the weight of the envelope in my hand. It felt like judgment. You asked for an explanation. Your Honor, I said, my explanation is that my husband is not just a liar. He is a man who has forgotten that in a digital world. Nothing is ever truly erased, and he has certainly forgotten the agreement he signed 3 years later, when he was begging me to save his life. I placed the envelope on the judge's desk. Mr. Thorne wants $10 million, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed in the silent room. I believe the document inside will show that he actually owes me $2 million. Julian's face went white. The blood drained from his skin so fast, it looked like a magic trick. He sat down hard, his legs giving out. He knew, in that split second, the memory of a dark room in New Jersey and a debt to a violent man came rushing back to him. Judge Vance picked up the envelope. He looked at me, then at Julian. He reached for the string to open it. The trap had snapped shut. The walk from my table to the judge's bench was a distance of perhaps 15 feet. Yet it felt like crossing a bridge between two distinct eras of my life. Behind me lay the era of the victim, the wife who had been duped, cheated, and gaslit. Ahead of me, resting in the hands of a curious and stern judge, lay the era of the victor. The courtroom was so silent I could hear the hum of the ventilation system and the nervous rhythmic tapping of Marcus Blackwood's pen against his legal pad. As I extended the yellow envelope toward Judge Vance, Blackwood practically vaulted from his chair. "Objection!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with the sudden intensity of his panic. "Your Honor, this is trial by ambush. The defense cannot simply introduce surprise evidence in the middle of a hearing without prior discovery. We have not seen these documents. We have not had a chance to authenticate them. This is highly irregular and prejudicial to my client." He was right. Of course, in a standard proceeding, this would be a violation of protocol. But family court, specifically during emergency motion hearings regarding asset dissipation, operates with a degree of discretion that criminal courts do not. Judge Vance looked at Blackwood over the rim of his glasses, his expression one of mild annoyance, like a teacher dealing with an unruly student. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge said, his voice calm and gravelly, "your client has just accused this woman of fraud, coercion, and mental instability. He has requested $10 million in immediate relief based on a document she claims is a forgery. Given the severity of these accusations, I am inclined to see whatever proof she claims to possess. If it is irrelevant, I will disregard it. Sit down." Blackwood sank back into his chair, but he did not relax. He leaned over to Julian, whispering frantically. I didn't need to hear the words to know what he was saying. He was asking, "What is in the envelope?" "Julian, is there anything else you haven't told me?" I saw Julian shake his head. He looked confused, genuinely bewildered. He was searching his memory, scanning the archives of his lies, trying to figure out what I could possibly have. He was confident he had destroyed everything. He was confident he had won. Judge Vance took the envelope. He held it for a moment, weighing it, before untying the red string that wound around the closure buttons. The sound of the paper unwinding was sharp and final. He reached inside and pulled out the first item. It was a thick document, bound in blue legal backing. "The original prenuptial agreement," Judge Vance read aloud, glancing at the cover page. He flipped it open. Notarized by Samuel J. Cohen, dated October 4th, 5 years ago, 6 days before the wedding. He looked up at Julian. And here's the interesting part. Mr. Thorne, this document contains not only signatures, but biometric thumbprints on the final page, mandated by the firm Ms. Foxworth uses. The judge held up the page. 2 dark, distinct ink swirls sat next to the signatures. Furthermore, the judge continued, reaching back into the envelope, there is a flash drive attached. I assume this contains the video recording of the signing. It does, Your Honor, I said, my voice steady. A continuous, unedited, 40-minute video showing Mr. Thorne reading the document, discussing it with his own independent counsel paid for by me and signing it willingly. He is laughing in the video. He even makes a joke about how the legal jargon is boring. Julian's face had gone the color of ash. The coercion narrative was evaporating before his eyes. The video evidence was a death blow to his claim of duress. But that was just the appetizer. However, Judge Vance said, placing the prenup to the side, there is something else in here. He reached into the envelope again and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. It was not on the crisp, white bond paper of a law firm. It was on slightly yellowed, textured paper, the kind used for high-end personal stationery, the kind I kept in my private study. Judge Vance unfolded it. He adjusted his glasses. He began to read. The silence in the room stretched, becoming heavy and suffocating. I watched the judge's eyes move left to right, line by line. I saw his eyebrows knit together in confusion, then shoot up in genuine shock. He stopped reading halfway through, looked up at me, then looked back down to finish the page. When he finally lowered the paper, his expression had changed completely. The judicial detachment was gone. In its place was a look of cold, hard scrutiny. He turned his chair slowly to face the plaintiff's table. Mr. Thorne, Judge Vance said. His voice was no longer loud. It was dangerously quiet. Do you recognize this document? Julian squinted, leaning forward. I do not know what that is. Your Honor, she probably forged it, just like she claims I forged the other one. It is titled, the judge read, enunciating every syllable, Irrevocable Waiver of Marital Assets and Indemnification Agreement. It is dated 3 years ago. I saw the exact moment the bullet hit him. Julian's body went rigid. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes widened until the whites were visible all around the irises. The blood drained from his face so completely that he looked like a wax figure. He remembered. Of course he remembered. How could he forget the night he thought he was going to die? It was 3 years ago. A rainy Tuesday in November. Julian had come home with a split lip and a terrified look in his eyes. He had fallen into a gambling debt hole that no amount of charm could fix. He owed $750,000 to a syndicate operating out of New Jersey people who did not send demand letters, but sent men with baseball bats. They had given him 48 hours to pay, or he would disappear. He had fallen to his knees in my library, sobbing, clutching the hem of my skirt. He confessed everything, or at least the financial part of it. He begged me to save him. I had agreed to pay the debt, but I was not a fool. I told him I would clear his ledger, but in exchange, he had to clear mine. I typed up the agreement myself, right there on my vintage typewriter. It was a simple trade. I would pay off his debt through a shell company so it couldn't be traced back to him. In return, he acknowledged that he had made absolutely no financial or strategic contribution to Orionis Systems. He acknowledged that his debts were solely his own, and most importantly, he waived any and all rights to claim spousal support or a division of assets in the event of a divorce. He had signed it with a shaking hand, his tears staining the paper. I will sign anything, Layla. He had blubbered that night. Just please, do not let them kill me. I do not care about the money. I just want to live. After he signed it, I had held the document up. Then, in a moment of apparent mercy, I had walked over to the fireplace. I held a piece of paper over the flames and let it drop. He watched it burn to ash, believing his shame had vanished with the smoke. A fresh start, I had told him. He had believed me. He had believed that the only record of his humiliation was gone. He had forgotten that I was a CEO who backed up data in 3 different locations. I had burned a photocopy, the original, with the ink still wet from his pen, had gone into the yellow envelope, and then into a safety deposit box that very night. "Let me read a pertinent paragraph," Judge Vance said, breaking the silence. "I, Julian Thorne, hereby acknowledge that my personal debts, totaling $750,000, are being satisfied by my wife, Layla Foxworth, as an act of grace. In consideration of this payment, I irrevocably waive any future claim to the marital estate, including but not limited to Orionis Systems, real estate holdings, and liquid assets. I acknowledge that I have contributed nothing to the value of said estate." The judge looked up. "It is signed by you, Mr. Thorne, and it is witnessed by Frank O'Connor." Julian made a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. He slumped in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if the floor were tilting beneath him. "But," Julian stammered, his voice a dry rasp, "but I saw you burn it. I saw you burn it in the fireplace." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. He had just confessed. By admitting he saw me burn it, he admitted the document existed. He admitted he signed it. Blackwood dropped his pen. It clattered loudly on the table. He stared at Julian with a look of pure horror. He realized instantly that his client had withheld the single most damaging piece of information possible. His entire case, the duress, the contribution to the company, the demand for millions had just been obliterated by his client's own signature. "You burned it," Julian repeated, looking at me with the eyes of a trapped animal. "You promised. You said it was a fresh start. You said you would never use it against me." I stood up again. I felt calm, powerful, and utterly vindicated. "I made you a promise, Julian," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I promised I would never use that document to shame you publicly. I promised I would keep your secret." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But I never promised to destroy it if you decided to betray me. I kept it as insurance, and you just filed the claim." Julian looked at Blackwood for help, but the lawyer physically recoiled, shifting his chair away from his client. There is no defense for a client who lies to his own counsel about a signed waiver of rights. Blackwood knew his professional reputation was teetering on the edge of a cliff. "Your Honor," Blackwood said, his voice weak, stripped of all its earlier bluster, I was not aware of the existence of this document." "Clearly," Judge Vance said dryly. He looked at the paper again, shaking his head. "This changes everything. This is not just a prenuptial agreement dispute anymore. This is a contractual waiver signed during the marriage, for significant consideration, namely, paying off a massive gambling debt to—" The judge peered at the paper. "To an entity known as Jersey Holdings, LLC. A shell company I used to pay his creditors. Your Honor," I clarified. "I have the wire transfer receipts to match the date of this agreement." Julian was shaking his head violently now. No. I was under duress then too. I was scared. I did not know what I was signing." "You just said you saw me burn it and that I promised not to use it," I countered smoothly. "You cannot claim you didn't know what it was and simultaneously claim I promised to hide it. You knew exactly what it was. Julian, it was the price of your life." The judge looked at Julian with an expression that went beyond legal judgment. It was moral disgust. He saw the man for what he was, a coward who had bitten the hand that saved him, and was now trying to steal the ring off that hand. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Vance said, placing the document down on top of the stack, "I suggest you take 5 minutes to confer with your client, because from where I am sitting, this document not only invalidates your motion for support, it suggests your client has committed perjury in his earlier testimony regarding his contributions to the marital estate." Blackwood looked like he wanted to vanish. He nodded stiffly. "Thank you, Your Honor." But he didn't turn to console Julian. He turned to him with eyes full of fury. Julian was staring at the table, his world collapsing in real time. He had thought he was playing poker against a novice, only to realize I had been holding a royal flush for 3 years. I sat back down. Eleanor leaned over to me. "That," she whispered, a rare smile touching her lips, "was the most brutal thing I have ever seen in a courtroom. Remind me never to cross you." He crossed himself. "Eleanor," I whispered back, watching Julian tremble. "I just provided the nails for the crucifixion." The revelation of the waiver had been a scalpel, slicing through the meat of Julian's defense with precision, but I did not want surgery. I wanted an autopsy. I wanted to lay bare every rotting organ of his deception until there was nothing left but the cold, hard bones of truth. "Your Honor," I said, signaling to Eleanor, "we are not done." Eleanor stood up. She did not pace like Blackwood. She moved with the terrifying inevitability of a glacier. In her hands, she held a black binder thick, heavy, and ominous. "We have established that Mr. Thorne, or whatever name he chooses to use, has waived his rights to the marital estate," Eleanor said, her voice crisp. "But the defense would like to address the matter of the $10 million he requested for support. We believe this request is not just unfounded, but an attempt to cover up a felony." "A felony?" Judge Vance asked, leaning forward. "Several felonies, Your Honor," Eleanor replied. She opened the binder. "Exhibit D through F, bank statements from the Orionis Charitable Foundation." She handed copies to the bailiff. Julian watched the transfer of paper with wide, terrified eyes. He knew what was in those accounts, or rather, he knew what was missing from them. "Over the last 18 months," Eleanor narrated, "Mr. Thorne, using his position as external affairs advisor, gained signatory access to the Foundation's discretionary fund. This fund is intended for emergency medical grants for underprivileged children. Instead, we have tracked a series of withdrawals totaling $2,150,000. The number hung in the air. $2 million meant for sick children. These withdrawals," Eleanor continued, flipping a page, "were not sent to hospitals. They were sent to shell accounts in the Cayman Islands, and from there, wire transferred to 2 primary recipients, the Bellagio Casino in Las Vegas, and a private account under the name Monica Reeves." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. It started in the back row with the press and washed forward like a wave. Monica Reeves, my executive assistant, the woman I had trusted, the woman Julian was sleeping with. "We have receipts," Eleanor said, her tone devoid of emotion. "We have IP logs. We have the digital trail of a man stealing from dying children to fund a baccarat habit and a mistress." Julian jumped to his feet. "That is a lie. Those were legitimate consulting fees, Monica. Ms. Reeves was doing contract work for the Foundation." "Contract work." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Does contract work typically involve purchasing a Porsche Cayenne and a condo in Miami? Because that is where the money went. Mr. Thorne." "You cannot prove I authorized that," Julian screamed. His facade of the cool, collected businessman had completely shattered. He was sweating profusely, his hair disheveled, his tie crooked. "Layla authorized it. She is trying to frame me." "We expected a denial," I said. Speaking up from my seat, I pressed a button on the remote control that had been set up on our table. A large monitor to the side of the judge's bench flickered to life. The image was grainy but clear enough. It was the interior of Julian's home office. The timestamp was from 3 weeks ago. On the screen, Julian was sitting in his leather chair, a glass of scotch in one hand, Monica on his lap. The audio was crystal clear, captured by the bug I had planted in his espresso machine. "She is so stupid, babe." Julian's voice filled the courtroom, slurred with alcohol and arrogance. "She thinks the charity fund is just a tax write-off. She never checks the ledger. I pulled another 50 grand today. We are going to bleed her dry before the divorce even hits the papers." "What if she finds out?" Monica's voice asked. "She won't." Julian laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that made my skin crawl. "Layla is weak. She is so desperate for me to love her she would sign over the company if I kissed her right. I am going to take half her fortune, strip the assets, and leave that stupid wife of mine crying in an empty penthouse." The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the silence of shock, of collective disgust. Even Marcus Blackwood looked sick. He stared at the blank screen, then slowly turned his head to look at his client. The look on his face said everything. "You are done." The supporters Julian had brought a few friends from the club. A distant cousin were looking down at their shoes, physically leaning away from him as if his toxicity was contagious. That is fake," Julian yelled, his voice cracking into a high-pitched screech. "That is AI. That is a deep fake. She generated it. Technology can do anything. Now, I never said that." "Mr. Thorne," Judge Vance said, his voice like a hammer striking stone. "Sit down." "I will not sit down," Julian shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "This is a kangaroo court. She is witch-hunting me. I am the victim here." "Sit down," Judge Vance roared, "or I will have you shackled to that chair." Julian collapsed into his seat, breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat looking for a sewer grate. "We are not finished, Your Honor," I said. Standing up again, I walked to the center of the aisle. I wanted nothing between me and him. "Mr. Thorne claims this is a deep fake. He claims he is Julian Thorne, a respectable venture capitalist, but that is the biggest lie of all." I pulled a final document from my folder. It was old, crinkled, with a mugshot stapled to the corner. "The man sitting before you is not Julian Thorne," I said, holding the paper up for the gallery to see. "His name is Gary Miller. He was born in Tampa, Florida, and this is his rap sheet." I began to read, my voice steady and unforgiving. 1998, arrested for check fraud. 2001, convicted of identity theft in Georgia. 2005, arrested for marriage fraud in Miami. He has a pattern, Your Honor. He finds women. He changes his name. He marries them or convinces them to invest in fake companies, and then he disappears with their savings. I walked closer to the defense table. Julian Gary was shaking his head, mumbling, "No, no, no," over and over again. "He is not a businessman," I said, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "He is a predator. He is a con artist who has been running from the law for 15 years, and he thought I was just another mark." "It is a lie," Julian shrieked. He lunged toward the table, grabbing a pitcher of water and hurling it at me. It missed, shattering against the floor in an explosion of glass and water. "Bailiff!" Judge Vance shouted. 2 officers moved instantly, stepping between me and Julian. Julian was standing, chest heaving, his face twisted into a mask of pure hate. "You bitch!" he screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "You ruined everything I had it all. You think you are smart. You are nothing. You are just a lonely, pathetic woman who had to buy a husband." "Mr. Thorne," Judge Vance banged his gavel so hard I thought the handle would snap. "One more word, and I will hold you in contempt and send you to a holding cell immediately." "He is not Mr. Thorne, Your Honor," I said quietly, brushing a shard of glass from my sleeve. "He is Gary Miller, and he is right about one thing. I was lonely, but I fixed that problem when I decided to divorce the parasite feeding on me." I looked at him, really looked at him. The handsome face I had once loved was gone. In its place was the snarling visage of a cornered criminal. "You are not just a bad husband, Gary," I said, using his real name like a weapon. "You are a thief. You are a fraud. You are an economic criminal." I turned to Marcus Blackwood. The lawyer was hurriedly packing his briefcase. He wasn't looking at papers anymore. He was looking at the exit sign. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, "I assume you were not paid with a retainer, but with a promise of a percentage of the settlement." Blackwood didn't answer. He just snapped his briefcase shut. He knew he wasn't getting paid. He knew that associating with Gary Miller was professional suicide. He stood up, gave a curt nod to the judge, and literally took a step away from his client's table. "Your Honor," Blackwood muttered, I I may need to recuse myself pending an ethics review of this new evidence. He was abandoning ship. Julian looked at his lawyer, then at the judge, then at the bailiffs, who were now standing ominously close to him. The realization hit him like a physical weight. The money was gone. The reputation was gone. The freedom was about to go. His arrogance evaporated, leaving behind a naked, trembling fear. He slumped onto the table, burying his face in his arms. He wasn't crying for me, or for us. He was crying because for the first time in his life, the con hadn't worked, the mask had been ripped off, and the world was finally seeing the ugly, hollow thing underneath. The courtroom had become a theater of ruin, but the final act required one more voice. Justice is not just about facts and figures. It is about the human cost of deception. Julian Gary had reduced me to a bank account, but he had done it before, and those ghosts deserved to be heard. Your Honor, Eleanor announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the gallery. We have one final witness. We call Mrs. Sarah Jenkins to the stand. The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman walked in. She was petite, wearing a simple floral dress that had seen better days. Clutching a worn handbag with white-knuckled intensity, she looked to be in her late 40s, but her face bore the deep lines of someone who had weathered a storm that never quite ended. Julian's head snapped up. For a moment, there was no recognition in his eyes. He had discarded so many people, used so many names, that the faces had likely blurred into a singular mass of past marks. But as she walked down the aisle, stepping into the pool of light near the witness stand, recognition dawned on him like a slow horror. Sarah, he whispered. The name escaped his lips like a curse. Sarah Jenkins did not look at him. She walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture, a stain on the floor. She took the stand, swore the oath, and sat down, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Mrs. Jenkins, Eleanor asked gently, do you know the man sitting at the defense table? Sarah took a deep breath. She turned her head slowly and looked at Julian. Her eyes were not filled with rage, but with a profound, exhausted pity. I know him as Sebastian Thorne, she said, her voice quiet but steady. We were married in Savannah, Georgia, 12 years ago. The gallery gasped again. Another alias, another life. And how did your marriage end, Mrs. Jenkins? Eleanor asked. It ended when I came home from a double shift at the hospital and found the house empty, Sarah said, blinking back tears. Not just empty of him, empty of everything, the furniture, the electronics, my jewelry, even the dog. He took the dog. A ripple of genuine anger went through the room. Stealing money was one thing. Stealing a dog was a cruelty that resonated on a different frequency. He left a note, Sarah continued, wiping her cheek. He said he was in trouble with the mob and had to run to protect me. He said he took the assets to pay them off so they wouldn't hurt me. I believed him. I spent 2 years paying off the debts he left in my name. I lost my house. I lost my credit. I lost my ability to trust another human being. She looked directly at Julian. But he wasn't protecting me. He was just moving on to the next victim. I saw his picture in a magazine 6 months ago, on the arm of Ms. Foxworth. He was wearing a suit I bought him for his birthday. Julian shrank in his seat. He looked small, shriveled. The imposing figure of the venture capitalist had dissolved, leaving behind a pathetic, frightened man. Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins, Eleanor said softly. No further questions. Judge Vance looked at Julian. The judge's expression was one of profound distaste, as if he had just stepped in something foul. Mr. Thorne or Mr. Miller, do you have any cross-examination or perhaps an explanation for why you are still legally married to this woman while standing here today? Julian tried to stand, but his legs seemed to fail him. He slumped back, his hands grasping the table edge. Then, the tears came. Not the fake, single-tear performance he had given earlier. These were the ugly, heaving sobs of a man who realized the walls were closing in. I am sorry, he blubbered, snot running down his nose. He looked at Sarah, then at me. I am sorry, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I got in over my head. I needed the money. I was going to pay it back. I swear. Layla, I was going to pay you back once the company took off. He turned to me, his eyes pleading, desperate. Layla, please, look at me. It is Julian. Remember Italy. Remember the cliffs. We were happy. I made you happy. You said I was the only one who understood you. Do not do this to me. Do not send me to jail. We can work this out. I will sign anything. Just make it stop. We had good times, he pleaded, his voice cracking. We loved each other. You cannot just turn that off. I know you still love me. I can see it. Please, baby. Please. The room went silent, waiting for my reaction. It was the classic manipulator's gambit appeal to the victim's empathy. Weaponize the shared history. Twist the knife of nostalgia. I looked at him. I remembered Italy. I remembered the wind in my hair and the warmth of his hand in mine. I remembered feeling safe. But then I looked at Sarah Jenkins, sitting in the witness box, a woman whose life he had incinerated without a second thought. I looked at the bank statements detailing the stolen charity funds. I looked at the yellow envelope. You are right, Gary, I said, my voice cutting through his sobbing like a blade of ice. We did have good times. I was in love. Hope flared in his eyes. He thought he had found a crack in the armor. But I was in love with the character you created, I continued, extinguishing that hope instantly. I was in love with Julian Thorne, the venture capitalist who understood my grief. I was never in love with Gary Miller, the con artist who steals from sick children and abandons wives in empty houses. I stood up and walked to the edge of my table. You played a role, I said. And you played it well, but the play is over. The curtain has fallen, and I am not the audience anymore. I am the critic, and my review is that you are a fraud. Julian flinched as if I had struck him. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably now, a mix of self-pity and terror. Judge Vance cleared his throat. The sound was like a gavel strike in itself. He began to organize the papers in front of him, the prenup, the waiver, the bank statements, Sarah's testimony. He stacked them neatly, aligning the edges with deliberate precision. The court has heard enough, Judge Vance said. His voice was devoid of the patience he had shown at the beginning of the hearing. The evidence presented today paints a clear and disturbing picture. We have a prenuptial agreement that is valid. We have a postnuptial waiver that is valid. And we have irrefutable proof of systemic fraud, embezzlement, and perjury. He looked down at Julian. Mr. Miller, the judge said, using the real name with emphasis. Your request for spousal support is denied with prejudice. Your claim to the assets of Orionist Systems is denied. Your claim to the marital residence is denied. Julian let out a low moan. Furthermore, Judge Vance continued, his eyes hard, based on the evidence of the embezzlement from the Orionist Charitable Foundation, I am ordering you to make full restitution of the $2,150,000 you misappropriated. This debt is non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. I do not have it, Julian whispered. I spent it. Then you will spend the rest of your life paying it back, the judge snapped. Wage garnishment, asset seizure, whatever it takes. Mr. Foxworth's legal team will have full authority to pursue these funds. I leaned over to Eleanor. The penalty clause, I whispered. Eleanor nodded and stood up. Your Honor, per the terms of the prenuptial agreement, specifically Article 19 regarding breach of good faith, we request that the respondent be held liable for all legal fees incurred by the petitioner. Granted, Judge Vance said immediately. Mr. Miller, you will pay Ms. Foxworth's legal bills, and considering the caliber of Ms. Sterling's representation, I imagine that will be a substantial sum. It was the final financial nail in the coffin. He was leaving this marriage not with $500 million, but with a debt that would crush him for eternity. Is that all, Ms. Foxworth? Judge Vance asked, looking at me. Just one more thing, Your Honor, I said. I want the divorce granted today, effective immediately. I do not want to be married to this man for 1 second longer than necessary. The court sees no reason to delay, Judge Vance said. Judgment of absolute divorce is granted. The gavel came down, bang. The sound echoed through the room, a sharp, decisive punctuation mark to 5 years of my life. It was over. I was free. But the atmosphere in the room remained taut. The air was thick with the static electricity of unfinished business. Julian was still sitting there, a broken heap of a man. The bailiffs were moving closer. Blackwood was inching toward the door. Sarah Jenkins was weeping silently in the witness box, perhaps finding some closure in seeing the monster finally caged. I looked at Julian one last time. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the floor, muttering to himself, lost in the wreckage of his own greed. He had tried to steal the sun, and he had been burned to ash. There was a strange, hollow feeling in my chest. It wasn't happiness. Happiness is warm. This was cold. It was the satisfaction of a math equation finally balanced. It was the relief of a heavy weight being lifted, leaving the muscles sore but free. And Mr. Miller, Judge Vance said, his voice stopping the room's movement, do not get comfortable. We are not quite done with you yet. The judge reached for a final piece of paper, the one I had tipped him off about, the one Julian had written in a moment of drunken hubris, the letter to his mistress. The tension ratcheted up one last notch. We all watched the judge. He held the paper, reading it silently for a moment. Then, the most unexpected sound filled the courtroom. He laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a dry, incredulous bark of amusement, the sound of a man who has seen everything and is still surprised by the depth of human stupidity. "What is it, Your Honor?" Blackwood asked nervously, pausing his retreat. Judge Vance looked at Julian over the top of the paper, a smile playing on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "It seems," the judge said, "that Mr. Miller has some strong opinions about the judiciary." The judge's laugh was not a sound one expected to hear in a courtroom. It was not the polite chuckle of a colleague sharing a joke. It was a guttural, resonant boom that bounced off the mahogany walls and settled over the room like a physical weight. It was the sound of a man who had seen the absolute limit of human arrogance and found it absurdly comical. Judge Vance held the piece of paper in his hand, the final document I had retrieved from the digital trash bin of Julian's encrypted email server. It was a handwritten note, scanned and sent to Monica Reeves as an attachment, titled The Victory Plan. "Mr. Miller," Judge Vance said, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye, though his voice remained razor-sharp. "I have read many things in my 30 years on the bench, confessions, threats, pleas for mercy, but I have rarely read a character assessment of myself that is quite so candid." Julian looked up, his face a mask of confusion and dread. "What? What is that?" "It is a letter you wrote to Ms. Reeves," the judge replied, holding the paper up. "Dated 2 weeks ago. Let me share the relevant passage with the court, so we can all appreciate your insight." The judge cleared his throat, adjusted his spectacles, and began to read. "Do not worry about the hearing. Babe, I drew Judge Vance. He is a fossil, a senile old man who is more interested in his lunch break than the law. I will cry a little, talk about my broken heart, and that old fool will eat it up. He is easy to manipulate. I will have him signing the order for $10 million before he even realizes what hit him. He is a rubber stamp with a pulse." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the stenographer stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys in shock. Julian's mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry land. He looked at the judge, then at me, then back at the judge. There was no defense for this. There was no spinning it. He had insulted the one man who held his fate in his hands, and he had done it with the vulgar confidence of a mediocrity who believed he was a genius. Judge Vance lowered the paper slowly. The amusement vanished from his face, replaced by a cold granite authority. "Well, Mr. Miller," the judge said, leaning forward until he loomed over the bench, "this senile old man has a remarkably good memory, and this rubber stamp has a decision to make." "Your Honor, I was venting. It was a joke," Julian stammered, sweat pouring down his face now. I did not mean it. I have the utmost respect for this court. Save your breath, Vance snapped. You have insulted this court. You have defrauded your wife. You have stolen from charity. And you have perjured yourself under oath. You played a game, sir. And let me tell you something about games in my courtroom. The judge paused, letting the tension stretch until it was nearly unbearable. The House always wins. Judge Vance picked up his gavel. It looked heavy in his hand, a weapon of ultimate finality. The court is ready to rule, he announced, his voice booming. First, Vance declared, the petition for absolute divorce is granted, effective immediately. The marriage between Layla Foxworth and the man known as Julian Thorne or Gary Miller is dissolved. I felt a physical sensation in my chest, like a tight band snapping. I was free. I was Layla Foxworth again, whole and unattached. Second, the judge continued, relentless as a drumbeat. Regarding the division of assets, based on the valid prenuptial agreement and the binding waiver signed by the defendant, Mr. Miller is awarded 0% of the marital estate. He leaves this marriage with exactly what he brought into it, nothing. Julian let out a strangled sob, burying his head in his hands. Third, Vance said, his eyes narrowing. Regarding the misappropriation of funds from the Orionis Charitable Foundation, I am forwarding the evidence presented today. The bank statements, the wire transfers, and the audio recordings to the district attorney's office with a recommendation for immediate prosecution for embezzlement, wire fraud, and identity theft. No, Julian screamed, jumping up. You cannot do that. I will pay it back. I will work. Do not send me to prison. And finally, the judge said, ignoring the outburst entirely, given the defendant's history of flight, his use of multiple aliases, and the severity of the charges likely to be filed, this court considers him an extreme flight risk. Judge Vance looked toward the side of the courtroom where two uniformed officers had been standing quietly. He nodded once. Bailiffs, take the defendant into custody immediately. The reaction was instantaneous. The two officers moved with practiced speed, converging on Julian before he could even process the command. What? No, wait, Julian yelled, backing away, knocking his chair over. You cannot arrest me here. This is civil court. This is family court. It is a court of law, Mr. Miller, Judge Vance said coldly, and you are a criminal. Get him out of my sight. The officers grabbed Julian by the arms. He struggled, thrashing like a wild animal caught in a snare. Get off me. Do not touch me. Marcus, do something. He looked wildly for his lawyer, but Marcus Blackwood was already at the door, briefcase in hand, refusing to make eye contact. He had abandoned the sinking ship long ago. Layla, Julian screamed, turning his desperate, tear-streaked face toward me as the officers wrenched his arms behind his back. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut was the sweetest music I had ever heard. Click, click. Layla, tell them to stop. I am your husband. I love you. You cannot let them take me. He was dragged past my table. He looked at me, his eyes wide with terror, searching for a shred of the woman who had once looked at him with adoration. He was looking for the savior he had exploited for 5 years. But that woman was gone. She had died the day she found the fake painting. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal blazer. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression as calm as a frozen lake. Goodbye, Gary, I said softly. It was not a question. It was not an apology. It was an eviction notice. I was evicting him from my life, from my mind, and from my heart. You bitch! You heartless bitch! He howled as they dragged him toward the side door leading to the holding cells. His voice cracked, losing its polished veneer, devolving into the raw, ugly screech of a man who had lost everything. I made you. You are nothing without me. Nothing. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off his screams. The silence that rushed back into the courtroom was profound. It was the silence of a storm that had finally passed, leaving the air clean and crisp. Ms. Foxworth, Judge Vance said. I turned to the bench. The judge was looking at me, His face softened now. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "You conducted yourself with remarkable dignity today," he said. "It is not easy to dismantle a lie that you once lived inside of." "Thank you, Your Honor," I replied, bowing my head slightly. "And thank you for the laugh. It was cathartic." "Go home, Ms. Foxworth," Vance said, picking up his files. "Rebuild your empire, and maybe change your locks." "Way ahead of you, Your Honor." I turned to Eleanor, my lawyer, my warrior, my friend. She was smiling, a genuine, warm smile that lit up her stern face. "We did it," she whispered. "No," I corrected her, picking up my bag, the bag that had held the yellow envelope, the instrument of my liberation. "We didn't just do it, we finished it." I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The reporters in the back row parted like the Red Sea. Cameras flashed, blinding and rapid. But I didn't blink. I didn't hide my face. I had nothing to be ashamed of. I was not the victim of a con man. I was the survivor who had outsmarted him. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the courthouse and stepped out. The Boston air hit me first cold, bracing, and smelling of the ocean. Then came the light. The afternoon sun was dazzling, reflecting off the glass skyscrapers of the financial district. It was a golden hour, painting the world in hues of amber and hope. A mob of journalists was waiting at the bottom of the steps. They shouted questions, thrusting microphones into the air. "Ms. Foxworth, is it true he was a fraud?" "Layla, how do you feel about him going to prison? What is next for Oriona Systems?" I paused at the top of the stairs. I looked out at the city I had helped build, the city that Julian had tried to steal from me. I felt light. I felt powerful. I didn't answer their questions. I simply offered them a small, enigmatic smile, the smile of a woman who knows secrets the world is just beginning to guess at. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. My driver, a man who had been with my family since I was a child, opened the rear door. I walked down the steps, my heels clicking on the concrete, a rhythm of victory. I slid into the back seat of the car. The leather was cool and smelled of lavender. "Where to, Ms. Foxworth?" the driver asked, meeting my eyes in the rear-view mirror. "Forward, James," I said, looking out the window as the courthouse receded into the distance. "Just drive forward." The car pulled away. Merging into the traffic, I watched the courthouse disappear, and with it, the memory of Julian Thorne. He was just a number now, a case file, a cautionary tale. I opened my phone. I had a board meeting in an hour. We had a new gene therapy to launch. I had a company to run. I was Layla Foxworth, and I had won. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I really hope you enjoyed this tale of betrayal and ultimate justice. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening on your commute, while cooking dinner, or maybe relaxing before bed? Please let me know in the comments below. I love reading your stories. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the Scarlet Revenge Stories channel, liking the video, and hitting that hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to me.